Pero, ¿me ayudarías con esto? No, no, no
Ella,
prende.
ellos se dan cuenta cuando usted quiere hablar y
Ya,
te
ya,
lo
ya,
activan.
ya, ya.
Ellos
Ah,
están
ok.
protegidos por
Ah,
usted.
ok.
Así, pila.
Ah, está. Sí, sí. Sí, dale, dale, sí, sí, sí. Primero, Aurora, hola. No nos escucha.
Hola, ¿cómo están?
Ah, sí, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, gracias.
Aurora, ¿te parece entonces que yo voy a dar la bienvenida
Muy
eh,
bien,
y luego te paso la palabra
perfecto.
para que presentes al galardonado y así le damos tiempo a la otra colega de llegar.
Ajá, aunque algo, no sé si tú tienes el currículum del galardonado.
Ah, no, espera, espera, espérame. Tú, ajá. Oh.
Tú
Muy
tienes,
buenas. Listo, listo. Perdón, Aurora. Vamos, estamos en vivo, entonces
ah, bueno,
vamos a la mexicana construyendo de una sobre la marcha. Muy
muy
buenos
bien.
días a todas y todos los que están aquí presentes y los que están en línea. Es un honor poder compartir en este día eh, el reconocimiento a 2 premios de investigación sobre México y América Latina. Voy a ir traduciendo español-inglés, no, tampoco lo decidimos, en el medio justo estábamos decidiendo cómo realizarlo. Eh, well, welcome everyone, good morning, it's a pleasure to be here. We are and try to um, the best book of Mexican history and Latin America international politics. So my name is Mariana Parisian, and I will be here to presentation. Well, si les parece bien, este premio Luciano Tomassini Latin American International Relation Book Award y el Howard Cline Book Prize in History, in Mexican History, lo daremos el día de hoy. Pues bueno, voy a darle la palabra a la chair Aurora Gómez Galvarriato Freer del Colegio de México, quien está conectada en línea para presentar el mejor libro a la historia mexicana. Por favor, Aurora, adelante.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I am very, very happy and very honored to have chaired this committee and to be here with you. I wish I would be there in person, but well, at least we can talk and be together through digital means. We also in this committee there were several professors besides me. There was Corina Seltzman from Princeton University, Bertolt Gilabert Hidalgo from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and Rafael Rojas Gutiérrez, who is my colleague at El Colegio de México. And well, we all read 18 books that were sent to us to evaluate. And after reading these books carefully and discussing about them, we decided that the 2025 Howard F. Cline Book Prize in Mexican History should be awarded to the book The First Asians, A Trans-Pacific History, written by Diego Javier Luis and published by Harvard University Press. So thank you. Well, many congratulations, Diego Javier. And well, it was fantastic to read your book, and we really enjoyed it very much. I must say to everyone that it was not easy to decide, since several of the books evaluated were of exceptional quality. We really had, like, well, long discussions about the several books. However, we consider that this book stood out in several respects, including the originality of its topic, the novelty of its methodological approach, the careful and intelligent research it mobilized from a wide array of primary and secondary sources, the clear and well-structured narrative, and the relevance of its findings. The book, The First Asians in the Americas, A Trans-Pacific History, promises to explore the mobility of Asians in New Spain to understand how they built their lives and identities in a foreign land, as well as the diverse strategies they employed to seek fairer treatment in a regime aware of racial differences, which categorized the various ethnic groups arriving on the Manila galleon under the broad label of Chinese. The book fulfills the promise with clarity, depth, and methodological rigor throughout its pages, presenting strong arguments based on various sources, including letters, maps, notarial documents, and parish books. And of course, making a very good analysis out of them. It is a pertinent work that reflects on racialization, the construction of identities, and the adaptation mechanisms of migrants, whether coerced or voluntary, making it especially relevant to the present. It examines these phenomena from the perspective of marginalized subjects whose contributions have often been overlooked or downplayed in the historiography, highlighting their significance in the historical process of the Spanish Empire and thus offering a valuable addition to the field of study. The author captivates readers with agile prose, skillfully taking a global perspective and a broad temporal view. Luis offers a clear and well-founded explanations that help readers understand complex processes, context, and previously overlooked connections and their significance within the histories of the Spanish Empire, New Spain, and the Asian territories from which migrants departed. Finally, the text complies with the criteria for this contest. So this is why all the members of the selection committee voted unanimously to give this prestigious prize to Diego Javier Luis. So please give an applause to Diego Javier Luis for this wonderful achievement. And I wish I am able to meet you personally at some point. Diego, you are always welcome to Mexico. Please let me know when you come. It would be great to have you at El Colegio de México. And what follows is that Diego will give a presentation of his book.
So, Diego, please, could you present your book? Thank you.
I have a copy.
Perfect.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias por este gran honor, por compartir este lunes con nosotros, por estar aquí. Y yo escribí mis comentarios, mi charla en inglés, así que voy a seguir.
Si quieres pasármelo, yo lo...
Okay, gracias. It's truly an honor to stand before you today and to receive your words and for the introduction to the book. Thank you so much. What I'll do in the following 30 minutes is present give a kind of talk that's not necessarily a formal book talk, but to talk through my process of how I developed the arguments that are in the book, what motivated me to write the book, what are some of the central questions I sought to address within the archives that I consulted, and a number of the points that I hope that readers of the book will take away from the experience of reading it. Okay, so I have a presentation here, and hopefully that is visible. Okay. So this is the first Asians in the Americas, a trans-Pacific history. You've heard a little bit about it just now. And in brief, the book traces the movement of free and enslaved Asian subjects across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Mexico, through what are now called the Manila Galleons, which ran basically uninterrupted between colonies in the Philippines, mainly Manila and Cavite, and landing in Acapulco in Mexico. The people who sailed on those galleons, especially the Asian subjects, I traced their lives as they integrate into colonial Mexican society during the early modern period and disperse outwards. I traced trajectories as far north as what's now the state of Oregon, as early as the late 16th and early 17th century, down to Peru as well, through Central America, and dispersing outwards across the Atlantic to the Iberian Peninsula as well. So the scope of the book begins with the advent of the galleons, with the completion of the first Spanish west to east voyage across the Pacific, and ends with the onset of the independence movements, which spell the end of the galleons across the Pacific. So who were the people that were on these galleons? So when I refer to free and enslaved Asian subjects, I'm talking about people from as far west as Gujarat in South Asia to as far east as Nagasaki in Japan, and everywhere between. That being said, the largest concentrations of people who crossed the Pacific on these galleons came from the Philippine archipelago itself, largely from Luzon and the Visayas, but elsewhere too. Most of the free Asian subjects who crossed were from the Philippines, while the majority of the enslaved came from the Bay of Bengal area of South Asia. They had been enslaved through Portuguese circuits of enslavement in the Indian Ocean world and sold in Manila to Spanish enslavers and then trafficked across the Pacific. We also have large numbers of enslaved people who are indigenous to the Philippines as well. Many of them were at least formally designated as Muslim, which was a central justification of their enslavement within Spanish law. So through tracing this history, I make three central interventions: one geographic, one chronological, and one methodological. The geographic intervention, which I had the pleasure of speaking about yesterday with many of my colleagues who have also been leaders in the field of the Spanish Pacific, is precisely to emphasize the role of the Pacific in the construction of colonial society, politics, culture, and demographics in the Americas, primarily in Mexico. As we know, the field of colonial Latin American studies has often turned either hemispherically or towards the Atlantic in its development over the past many decades. And the history of the Pacific is a foundational space that has been sort of categorically written out of that story. And so a lot of my impetus for tracing the movements of people across the Pacific and understanding what they made of their lives in Mexico and beyond was part of this movement to bring Spanish Pacific studies in conversation with colonial Latin American studies. The second major intervention is chronological in nature, and this is a kind of connecting Asian Latin American studies and by extension Asian American studies as well to the history of the Spanish Empire. which is to say that the history of Asians in the hemisphere does not begin with indenture in the 19th century. It does not begin with more familiar stories about railroad construction or contract labor. Or any of the sort of other canonical moments of 19th century Asian diasporic movement in the Americas, but to say that it went indeed back to the 16th century. We have centuries, literal centuries of content that forms, in my view, a foundational origin point for understanding later dynamics in diasporic movement in the 19th century and beyond as well. And finally, the third intervention is methodological. I look at this movement through the prism of race making and racial formation, understanding perceptions of difference as they adapt, evolve across space and time, and sort of not only the formation of categories and identifications to describe Asian subjects of Spanish Empire, but also how those people responded to the formation of those categories, how they negotiated acquiring adverse identifications within the imperial world. And in many ways, talking about this here and sort of receiving this recognition is a full circle moment for me, because I first presented this work at Alasa in 2018, I believe it was, in Barcelona. It was my first major international conference that I presented at, still as a graduate student. And one of the things that really stayed with me about that first presentation of this work, I was looking at people who were called chinos, and I'll talk about that label in just a second, who were applying for licenses to carry weapons in central Mexico, and sort of some of the laws and customs that first prevented chinos from carrying weapons for their kind of association with being rebellious subjects, but then also the process by which even people who were granted exceptional status to be able to carry weapons, despite the fact that they were called chinos, how those special exemptions were often contested and disregarded by local magistrates in many jurisdictions throughout central Mexico. And the response to this kind of methodological orientation towards race making was heavily contested at that first presentation, and that's when I learned that actually the historiography of race in the colonial period is very contentious, but in many ways that experience reinforced my determination to understand how these perceptions of difference were operating and how people self-fashioned in response to those perceptions of difference in ways that I find very compelling to describe as processes of racial formation, and in ways that engage this work with other fields and chronologies and geographies and empires where processes of racial formation were active and ongoing. In so doing, I argue that the people who are called chinos, and so basically Asian subjects who disembarked in Acapulco, after there's a kind of process by which the chino category forms that I trace in the book, but basically by the early 17th century, almost everyone was being described as either Indio Chino or Chino, and this was a legal categorization that thrust these people into the emergent sistema de castas in Mexico, and was determinative of who could be enslaved and why. Made these people vulnerable to inquisitorial denunciation, and also applied a wide range of laws regarding trades that they could practice, weapons that could or could not be carried, where they could live, so on and so forth. And so basically I'm arguing that that the formation of this category and the ways that people responded to it made chinos into a new kind of globally mobile subject. Chinos could be described as, and it's precisely because of the construction of the category itself, chinos could be described as white, chinos could be described as black, any gradation between, chinos could be Catholic, chinos could be Muslim, they could hold other spiritual beliefs entirely, chinos could be low-paid wage laborers, they could be lower-ranking members of the colonial elite who themselves were enslavers. Basically, there's, and from a wide range of ethno-linguistic groups as well. So there's basically nothing intrinsic to, that connected the people who were called chinos besides the fact that they had crossed the Pacific, they were perceived as coming from Asia, and it was that categorization that then begins to engender certain connections and formations, diasporic formations among people who are called chinos. So it's really the response to the categorization that's more of a kind of a cohering factor within the category than the fact of the kind of wide, capacious function of the category itself. Okay, and basically all of this had to be built up piece by piece using archival records that are located, for example, at the Archivo General de la Nación, Mexico, the Archivo General de Indias in Sevilla, the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines, and many other institutions besides. As those of you who work with early modern sources and colonial sources know, there are no sort of sweeping overview accounts of, for example, Trans-Pacific Asian movement, or sweeping accounts defining who exactly chinos were. All of this has to be built using what I would describe as a global microhistorical approach, piecing together these fragments and tracing the stories that are told by those fragments. Okay. And this is a map that I often like to show alongside the book, which imagines the space of the Indies, of the West Indies, right? Everything west of the Iberian Peninsula, and we have this dotted line crossing the Pacific, which is precisely the line of the Manila galleons connecting the Philippines to Mexico, which in this formulation, flanked by both the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, is at the center, really, of the Spanish Empire. Okay, so how did I come to this topic? So once upon a time, I was a graduate student in search of a dissertation topic in between fields, and the person who would become my advisor at Brown University, Evelyn Hudehart, a name perhaps familiar to many of you, said that, you know, if I was interested in looking at these kinds of understudied stories of empire in the Americas, that I had to read a book by Juan González de Mendoza, which was a bestseller in its time about the Kingdom of China. Came out in 1585, published in Rome, and one of the things that was really striking about this book by Mendoza was his praise of China. You know, in his view, China even exceeded Spanish civilization in many categories of such as bureaucratic organization, charity to the poor, and also in writing and printing, as well as in gunpowder, which Mendoza sort of identified as being more ancient or having longer roots in China than in Western Europe. You know, China had a print culture and gunpowder before. So this was for me a kind of moment of imperial crisis, reading Mendoza, understanding that, you know, the Spanish encounter with China and the limitations of imperial power projection in Asia, and I found that very compelling. And for me, that became a kind of archival methodology as well, thinking through, what happens when you're looking at the frontier of empire and power projection comes undone in the face of other geopolitical entities, and what voices, as a consequence, what networks come to the fore, what new archival possibilities emerge through the cracks at the frontier of the empire. And for me, that's one of the really compelling interventions or innovations about Spanish Pacific studies, is this kind of view of empire through limitation and through and that became a way of rethinking global history as well, right? Not this kind of macro historical tracing of economic commercial flows through the Galleon trade, but thinking rather from the ground up, from these moments of rupture. So what also shocked me about reading this book is that I had never heard before this about the Spanish encounter with China, and very little about the Spanish encounter with the Pacific more broadly. As Mendoza writes, the formation of colonialism in the Philippines and how foundational that was to what was happening across the Pacific and Mexico as well. The second entry point is more on a personal register, and that's precisely that this history was a kind of entry point for thinking through my own process of identity formation as well. And I put this image up here. These are my grandparents on their wedding day in New York City in the middle of the 1940s. My grandfather was Chinese from Guangdong province, like many from the region of Taishan, went to Cuba. His family had been coming and going for a couple of generations. They likely arrived at the end of the 19th century. He had arrived towards the beginning of the 20th century. There he met my grandmother, an Afro-Cuban woman, herself the descendant of black freedom fighters during the Independence War, and they married and started a new life in New York City. And so part of the process of being drawn and compelled to the earliest accounts of people who connected Asia and Latin America in their own family stories was part of what compelled me to this, and sort of understanding that it's okay to study something that matters on a personal level as well as on an intellectual academic level. And I felt what Loxiu has described as a kind of diasporic kinship or affinity, or affect, a diasporic affect for these histories, and wanting to understand them on a familial level as well, which I think kind of drew me towards these fragments that, you might see a name in an archive with very little kind of contextual information, but wanting to rebuild that world and the range of possible decisions that led to that person being recorded in a particular archive. And in so doing, that's the connection between this early history and diasporic Asian Latin American histories more broadly. Okay, so in telling this story, there were a few questions archival questions that I want to talk about briefly. One is I wanted to understand the kind of push-pull factors from the Philippines that resulted in this movement across the Pacific. I mean, there were roughly 20,000 free and enslaved Asian people who arrived in the Americas during the early modern period. And I wanted to take the history of the Philippines very seriously in this regard. The sites of arrival being as important, or the sites of departure being as important as the sites of arrival. And that drew me towards the history of the Chinese in the Philippines. And one of the reasons for that is that Manila hosts a population at the turn of the 17th century of 20 to 30,000 Chinese, many of whom are formally not converted to Catholicism. And this kind of demographic diversity that we find in Manila at a time when there are perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 Spanish residents in the city at the same time is one of the factors that really makes the colony exceptional within the Spanish Empire. This at least formal this formal allowance of a non-converted population for the sake of the economic vitality of the city, and so I trace the buildup to one of the early flashpoints in the conflict between this Chinese community and the Spanish colony, which is the uprising of 1603, which results in the massacre of some 20,000 Chinese people in and around Manila. And this becomes part of the story of trans-Pacific mobility because I found that in the aftermath of this uprising, the city, without the farmers, the blacksmiths, the people who were foundational to the daily operations of the city, which, I mean, many of them were part of this Chinese community, that the city begins to starve. And so in the immediate aftermath of this uprising, there's a lean into the slave trade, to converging on Manila from Macau, from Malacca, from the Spice Islands, from elsewhere in the Indian Ocean world. Again, this is happening during the what's referred to as the Two Crowns period, during which the Spanish crown, at least formally, rules over both the Spanish and the Portuguese empire, which results in this kind of unprecedented commercial exchange between both the Spanish and the Portuguese spheres. So at the same time that there's this growing demand for captives in Manila, there's also new access to those captives through Portuguese routes, slave trading routes. You also have a heightened dependency on indigenous populations in the Philippines, and many of those people end up sailing on the galleons. I mean, for the majority of trans-Pacific voyages, most people sailing on the galleons were from the Philippines, from the area immediately around Manila, primarily. So that's one of the central questions in the story, is how we see the emergence of trans-Pacific trafficking and enslaved people, and a dependency on sailors from the Philippines, many of whom would remain in Acapulco, at least on the one hand formally, through employment with the formal employment as dock workers, as carpenters, as blacksmiths, porters, so on and so forth. And many sailors would also desert elsewhere and disperse outwards through central Mexico as well, many going north from Acapulco to Coyuca, to Colima, and elsewhere along the coast. Another question that drove this study is, and by the way, this is a 1671 map of Manila, demonstrating the kind of urban segregation between the walled city of Intramuros and across to the east, the Parian, which was the Chinese quarter. From the middle of the 17th century and onwards, the cannons mounted on the walls of Intramuros would point not only out to sea, but also inwards to the Parian, demonstrating these kind of nascent fears against the Chinese community that would explode into these episodes of massacre beginning in 1603. Another one of the questions that compelled this study is, to what extent can we differentiate among the experiences of Asian subjects who are crossing the Pacific? over and against this kind of totalizing categorization of Chino. To what extent can we actually identify ethno-linguistic continuities across the Pacific, even despite relatively low population numbers with regards to other populations in colonial Mexico? And what I found was the Pacific Passage actually becomes a standout moment in the new connections that form in Mexico. For example, in many cases of intermarriage among people from different ethno-linguistic groups originating in Asia, one of the reference points in how witnesses to the marriage, for example, would explain their relationship to the people who are getting married is that they had crossed the Pacific together on the same ship, or they had known each other in Manila for many years. And so these kinds of references to trans-Pacific mobility are one of the kind of cohering factors in this community. Another is and part of the reason for that is the nature of the Pacific Passage itself. It takes, on average, 6 months to sail from Manila to Acapulco. The conditions are horrific. Many, if not most, have to sleep topside because the hulls of the ships are filled with commercial goods like the porcelains and lacquers and all of the products that are basically the central reason for a trans-Pacific exchange, and that so astounded merchants and elites in Mexico and in Peru and elsewhere. And so there's this kind of a common experience to having sort of suffered in this passage and having gone through very cold climates in the North Pacific, having weathered storms, and so you have that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have this kind of very ritualized Catholic practice on the ship as well. The sort of regular holding of masses, the keeping time, using prayer, for example. There are a number of kind of highly ritualized elements of the passage itself that also engender new kinds of connections among the people who survived it. And so that becomes sort of one of the modes of explaining why we see people, even of different ethno-linguistic groups, forming new connections either through intermarriage or through godparentage, for example, through apprenticeship in various guilds. But we also see in some cases the coherence of ethno-linguistic communities, and where that's most pronounced is among the Kapampangan in colonial Mexico. The Kapampangan people come from the Pampanga province on the island of Luzon, and the Philippines were prominent in colonial armies, not only in the archipelago, but also in wars waged in the Spice Islands in what's now Indonesia, in Taiwan, in the Mariana Islands, etc. And so many people who cross the Pacific, who are Kapampangan, would reference their kind of long histories waging wars in colonial armies, or that they had been distinguished in some way in the Philippines and sought to reclaim that status in colonial Mexico. And so we have a number of examples of communities cohering around these claims of exceptional status or affecting some kind of social mobility. We have networks of merchants, for example, who are Kapampangan, who run mule trains from Acapulco up to Guadalajara, who would list each other within their credit networks. For example, when one named Domingo de Villalobos gets sick, he stays in the home of another Kapampangan merchant. And so we can see through these kinds of records, through wills, for example, the enduring connections among some of these communities. And a final central question that I'll talk about briefly is looking at the kinds of intellectual and spiritual formations within enslaved communities, within the obrajes, the textile mills of central Mexico, as well as plantations, and using that as a kind of window into the broader Afro-Asian encounter. And in my view, in this history, I mean, this is a kind of origin point for Afro-Asian encounters in the Americas, and as such, is, I think, one of the clearest examples of seeing the interaction, the encounter between the transatlantic and the transpacific in the Americas, looking at what's happening in the obrajes and how ideas about contesting the nature of enslavement, negotiating the enslaver-enslaved relationship, emerge through shared strategies among many groups. And so part of this work is also reconstructing those spiritual environments using a kind of reading against the grain of Inquisition records. Okay, and so as a last, I see that my time is quickly running out. So as a last point, I would like to talk about a few takeaways that I hope readers get from the experience of reading this book. One is, I talked a little bit about my personal connection to the history, but what I didn't mention earlier is that I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I felt I basically had no chance to quote unquote learn my own history as I was growing up, even going to college, and being from the Southeast in the U.S. kind of distanced me from the canonical narratives of Latino diaspora, for example, or Cuban diaspora, which I saw rooted primarily in Miami and New York City, for example, or even of the Asian American experience in the U.S., which I saw as a primarily West Coast narrative, and so I wanted to provide a kind of view from the outside of those narratives that also expands them, right? And so one of the ultimate ambitions of telling these stories is so that readers who may or may not see themselves as on the periphery of various kind of canonical narratives of diaspora might see themselves in the stories that are told in this book. People who have also been sort of categorically written out of diasporic histories. Another is, I was writing a lot of this book during the pandemic, during a phase of sort of rising awareness of anti-AAPI hate in the U.S. I've lived a number of years in Atlanta. I was very affected kind of emotionally and psychologically by the Atlanta spa shooting of 2022, for example. That was very front of mind as I was writing this book, and also, of course, thinking about what's happening now and thinking about this kind of genealogies, long genealogies of exclusion, deportation, and massacre that in many ways have kind of ideological origins in the early modern period and also in this history of transpacific mobility. So within this context, I found it personally empowering to know and to think about how Asian mobility in this hemisphere is not new. Just like the kind of technologies of violence are not new, mobility is not new as well. And that people of Asian origin have been in the Americas long before the founding of any nation in this hemisphere, and certainly before the founding of Jamestown as well, and many other colonies besides. And so I put this image up here. This is Cape Sebastian in southern Oregon, a site that was spotted by Spanish crew in 1603, which had Asian sailors aboard from a wide range of locales, which I think helps us rewrite some of those foundational stories about encounter in the Americas and also in what would become this country as well. So I think the broadest ambition for this story is to cultivate a sense of hemispheric belonging as a result of that. Okay, that's all I have for today. I'm looking forward to hearing any questions as well, if we have time for that. I don't know if that's, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diego. I don't know if there are some questions among the public.
Let me ask, do you have any questions for Diego? No, I don't think so. Do you have any question from Diego, Aurora?
Well, I would have plenty, but one that, well, perhaps it's also interesting for everyone is that this term Chino really has developed through time in Mexico in many different ways. In general, it means Asian, but it also means curly hair, and Asians usually don't have curly hair. So what are your, I don't know, what can you tell us about it? Because you do have curly hair. So you would be like Chino in the double sense of the world.
This is a really fantastic question. Thank you so much for the question. Right. So, I mean, there are a couple. One of the things that I'm really interested in tracing in the book is not only the emergence of the term Chino, but also how it evolves over time. And so, I think most people who are familiar with colonial Latin American history might think of Chino as being a category that's represented in the casta paintings. And in the casta paintings, Chino is an Afro-Indigenous category. And so I think that the kind of contemporary use of Chino and its relationship to hair likely has an origin in this kind of evolved meaning of Chino over time, which really takes place during the 18th century after the abolition of Chino enslavement in 1672, when Chino takes on these new meanings. However, one of the things that I found when I was conducting my research is that while the meaning of Chino is changing in some elite discourse through the casta paintings, where we see its use in notarial records and parish records and in other kinds of legal documentation, it retains the older meaning. And so you have these two significations of Chino taking form in the 18th century. And I would even go further to claim that that part of this dual meaning is, now that Chino is a category that designates freedom by the end of the 17th century, even though that process sort of has a kind of long negotiation that goes into the early 18th century. But now that Chino is a free category, and because Chino is so nebulous and has such a sort of capacious meaning with regard to physical descriptors, that it now becomes advantageous to claim being Chino. And so that kind of contributes to this widening meaning of the category. So that's sort of my take on on your question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no more question, thank you so much, Diego, for the book presentation, and congratulations for the work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Well, I will introduce another award. Good morning, everyone, dear colleagues. I'm honored to be with you today. Since 2012, the Luciano Tomassini Latin America International Relations Book Award has constantly recognized the most outstanding book on international relations and foreign policy in Latin America, contributing to dissemination of high-level research in our region, published in English, Spanish, or Portuguese in any country. The award honors Professor Luciano Tomassini, who is a remarkable thinker, political science, and analyst. He dedicated his talents to spread the word about the importance of understanding economic and political changes coming to the world in order to maximize Latin American presence on the international scene. To identify and understand this book, the committee agreed on a section process based on the evaluation criteria set out in the call for the world: originality of research, quality of analysis and writing, and significance of its contribution to the study of foreign policy and international relations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of the 17 books we received, the criteria considered by the committee were argument, contribution, timeless, publisher was not considered a relevant factor, and sources consultant and fit with the award criteria: outstanding book on Latin America foreign policy and international relations. So I'm here today in the representation of the committee members of 2025 Luciano Tomassini Latin America International Relations Book Award, formed by Christy Thornton from New York University, Ines Horst from Princeton University Press, Hector Hoyos Ayala from Stanford University, and me, Mariana Aparicio from National University Autonomous of Mexico. Following established precedent, the committee awarded that the honorable mention winner this year is Exit Wounds, How America's Gone Full Violence Across the Border by Eva Jusiton, published by the University of California Press in 2024. It's an incredible research, beautiful writing book that highlights the gun trafficking debate between Mexico and United States and the impact of both sides of the border, and the demand to stop flow of guns. While there are several books on this subject, it is not a typical international relation book. Very present days. Congratulations, Eva. And now, the 2025 Luciano Tomassini Latin America International Relations Books Awards goes to Nicaragua Must Survive, Sandinista Revolutionary Diplomacy in the Global Cold War, by Eline von Ommen, and published also to University of California Press in 2024. Eline's works is a multi-layered diplomatic history that balances states and non-state actors. It is an innovative study of the foreign policy of the Sandinista movement and government, backed by extensive archival research and interviews. The overarching narratives is well writing. It is a very strong entry to the nouns and the relevant to understand the present. The many years of research are evident. The book contributes new arguments to scholarship that are relevant not only in Nicaragua, but also in the region today. For all this reason, Nicaragua Must Survive, Sandinista Revolutionary Diplomacy in Global Cold War is the best book of 2025. Congratulations for Eline to this award. Well, I also translate in Spanish, but I think it's not necessary. We have a video of Eline because she's in a very beautiful moment. She's pregnant, so she can come with us today in person, but they send us a video. Let's see.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eline van Ommen, and I wanted to start out this presentation by thanking LASA and thanking particularly the Book Prize Committee for awarding me the Luciano Tomassini Latin American International Relations Book Awards. It's a real honor. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful, and I'm sorry that I can't be there in person due to good reasons, but personal reasons. So but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to give this online talk and share this video. So today I'm going to start by talking briefly about the journey that led towards the book. What questions did I have when I wrote it, and how did I try and answer these questions? And then I will explain what the book is arguing, the story it tells, and finally I will take a step back and reflect on some of the wider implications of the book and what I think we can take away from this international history of the Sandinista revolution. And in a way, my journey that led towards this book started in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from. And I was there at the International Institute of Social History to write my master's dissertation, to complete my MA degree, or at the LSE, the London School of Economics. And I knew I wanted to write my dissertation about Latin American revolutionary movements and the Cold War, as I was always kind of interested in questions of why and how people in the past had sought to kind of create different, more equal and just global orders and societies. And the kind of alternative visions for the future that existed in the past, and what happened when people tried to build these futures in the Cold War context. And based on what I found at the archive in Amsterdam, I decided to write my dissertation about the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, which triumphed on 19 July 1979. Because then this group of guerrillas toppled this anti-communist dictatorship. And the group of guerrillas was called the FSLN, the Frente Sandinista de Revolución Nacional, named after Augusto César Sandino, who was a general who fought against the US occupation of Nicaragua in the 1930s. So the Sandinista revolution we knew a lot less about at the time. It's starting to change now, thankfully. But it was the real first successful armed revolution in Latin America since the much more famous and well-known 1959 Cuban Revolution. So the archive in Amsterdam holds the records of several European pro-Sandinista solidarity groups. And for my MA, for master's dissertation, I wrote about the Dutch solidarity activists who supported the Sandinistas in the late 1970s and 1980s. And this project already gave me some insights into the transnational and particularly the European dimensions of this transnational global pro-Sandinista movement. And as I was doing research there were two key kind of things that stood out to me and surprised me and convinced me that there was more research that needed to be done into the Sandinista revolution. So the first thing I realized was that the revolution truly had a global impact. So I was born myself in 1990, the year when the Sandinistas lost power in elections. And I did not know until I started this project that in the 1980s, Nicaragua and Central America in general was such a hot topic, was very, people cared. People around the world protested against US foreign policy towards Nicaragua. So the United States president at the time, Ronald Reagan, he used illegal warfare and economic measures to weaken the Sandinista government. The English rock band The Clash produced a record called Sandinista. And the famous author and dissident Salman Rushdie, he visited Nicaragua in 1986. And he wrote a book about his experiences there, praising the revolution's accomplishments. And some of you might also recognize the women on the right, the smiling, breastfeeding Sandinista guerrilla, an image that was widely used to promote the revolution and the idea that this was a progressive, feminist, and popular project. And the second thing that surprised me was that the FSLN cared so much about solidarity activism. So I found many letters written by FSLN representatives, and in these letters the revolutionaries gave these activists information about what was going on in Nicaragua, They talked about the impact of the United States foreign policy on Nicaragua, but they also gave direct instructions to the activists. So they asked them to organize demonstrations, fundraising events, and letter writing campaigns. So the Sandinistas really coordinated European solidarity campaigns. They also visited Europe and the Netherlands on multiple occasions, so they sought to mobilize public opinion for the Sandinista cause. And I had not really expected this. Why would Sandinistas and high-ranking Sandinistas be interested in groups of left-wing activists in the Netherlands? And what does this tell us about the character of the Nicaragua Solidarity Movement and the Sandinistas' foreign policy more in general? And why did these left-wing, many kind of Marxist, socialist Nicaraguans even have an interest in Western Europe, considering that it was the United States that was attacking the revolution? So back before I kind of started this project, when I started out, it would have made more sense to me if they would have targeted mostly Cuba and the Soviet Union. And obviously these relations mattered as well, but the European dimension was very much a surprise to me. So I realized I was unlikely to find the answers I was looking for just in this archive in the Netherlands. So I continued my research, and for my doctoral research, I traveled to Nicaragua to improve my Spanish and get to know the country and its people. I started reaching out to former revolutionaries, mostly using Twitter, email, WhatsApp, and many were very kind and welcoming. They invited me to their houses, introduced me to their friends and former colleagues. I spoke to many former revolutionaries about their memories of the revolution, and I asked them why it appeared that they'd be so interested in European activists and countries. And I also asked if they had any documents left from this period, because accessing the Sandinista archives was, to me at least, was impossible. No one really was able to tell me with certainty where they were. Some people suggested everything was destroyed after the FSLN lost power in elections in 1990. But I was very lucky that on my final day, on my first research trip in Nicaragua, Alejandro Bendaña, the former Secretary General of Nicaragua's Foreign Ministry, who I had previously interviewed, he called me to tell me he found some boxes with material in his basement. And I'm very happy I decided to go to his house for one more time, and I was feeling quite tired already, but that was an amazing collection of documents which he allowed me to photograph. And these documents are really at the heart of the book, so I'm really grateful. And to get a fuller sense of the rationale and the implications of the Sandinistas' foreign policy, or revolutionary diplomacy, as I call it in the book, I also visited foreign ministry archives in Cuba, and libraries and archives in the United States, Germany, also East German archives I was particularly interested in, as it shed some light on kind of the Eastern dimension of the Sandinistas' foreign policy, and the UK. So taken together, this kind of multilingual, multi-archival source base allowed me to write Nicaragua Must Survive. So it's a book that I never really expected to write, and I think the journey shows the importance of perseverance and coincidence and personal connections, and also the value of combining the records and the histories of social movements with the records and the histories of foreign relations in a more traditional sense. And I think transnational history and diplomatic history combined can bring forth this really powerful and unknown histories. So what exactly is this book about? At its heart, I think it's a history of the many creative ways in which a revolutionary movement attempted, with varying results, to use the international environment for its own advantage. So the Sandinistas' revolutionary diplomacy ensured that the Sandinista revolution, the Nicaraguan revolution, had a significant global impact. and that as a result, a wide range of international actors were involved in shaping the revolution's trajectory. So the revolution's foreign policy, I argue in the book, was as much one of diplomats and government leaders as it was one of activists and music concerts. And at various moments in the revolution's history, the Sandinistas' revolutionary diplomacy was consequential. So the first, I think, key moment was that in the late 1970s, when the FSLN was still a small and kind of powerless guerrilla group that wasn't really seen as a threat, hiding in the mountains, the movement's international outreach allowed it to transform itself into what was widely considered to be the legitimate representative of the Nicaraguan people. And this really helped to isolate and significantly weaken the anti-communist dictatorship of the Somoza family, which was a family dynasty that had ruled Nicaragua since the 1930s. So by building connections with politicians and activists in Europe and the Americas, the Sandinistas also obtained money for weapons, which they used to fight and ultimately defeat the National Guard. And ultimately this led to the revolution's triumph in July 1979. And at that point, Somoza fled first to the United States and then to Paraguay, where he was later assassinated. And then in the early 1980s, in 1980 particularly, after taking power, the Sandinistas effectively used revolutionary diplomacy to raise money for their ambitious domestic programs, which were meant to improve healthcare, literacy, as well as combat inequality and poverty. So the example on the slide is the 1980 Literacy Crusade, which was a massive success, and it drove down literacy from 50% to 13%. And this was funded for a significant part by Western European governments and activists. And then after Ronald Reagan became president of the United States in 1981, the Sandinistas had to become more defensive. So Reagan was determined to roll back what he saw as Soviet-inspired communism in Central America. He imposed an economic embargo on Nicaragua, and the CIA also provided the anti-Sandinista counter-revolutionaries, also known as the Contras, with weapons, money, and military support and coordination. And this Contra war really did a lot of damage to the Nicaraguan revolution, even though the Contras, who were based in Nicaragua, in Honduras, never really held much territory in Nicaragua itself. But the human consequences were enormous. Around 50,000 people died, hundreds of thousands were displaced, and many more were wounded during this kind of decade-long conflict. And Reagan's kind of offensive then caused the FSLN to call upon these Western European solidarity activists to create a transnational anti-intervention movement. And this was meant to make audiences and politicians aware of the danger of United States military intervention in Central America. So they collaborated with the peace movement, and the anti-intervention movement organized demonstrations, they lobbied politicians, and they produced books and leaflets about kind of this long history of what they called US imperialism in Central America. And as the CIA document also showed here, this really frustrated United States officials who complained that the Western Europeans simply did not understand what they were trying to achieve in the region. And in a document, they specifically mentioned the importance of solidarity groups in kind of influencing public opinion, and in doing so also influencing government policy in what the US officials considered to be the wrong direction. And to defend the revolution and kind of strengthen it against attacks, the Sandinistas also invited thousands of people to come to Nicaragua and to experience firsthand what the revolution was like. So really some of these people went for, say, 2 weeks, just visiting, traveling around, meeting kind of officials, mostly very coordinated trips, but others went for kind of longer to help, say, with the coffee harvest or with building schools, kind of these more developmentalist projects to support the revolution. So really, the Sandinistas used these kind of personal and human and emotional connections to popularize the revolution abroad. And these brigadistas, or they were sometimes called kind of rucksack revolutionaries or sandalistas, this really helped to kind of bring home the Sandinista revolution, so to say, in Europe particularly. The FSLN also targeted governments. And specifically, they asked Western European governments to put pressure on Reagan to really change or stop his kind of aggressive policies towards Central America. So the Sandinistas argued that Western European political involvement in the region could help end the Contra War, and kind of in doing so, kind of de-escalate what could potentially become a really dangerous Cold War battle. And Reagan, Sandinista diplomats told Western Europeans, was wrongly and dangerously trying to impose a Cold War framework on Central America. And in doing so, they really smartly played into already existing European concerns about Reagan's Cold War rhetoric and politics. And the FSLN successfully argued that diplomacy and economic aid, developmental aid, could bring an end to a war which could have dangerous consequences for European security if it became fully swept up by kind of Cold War dynamics. And in part, this was a successful strategy. The revolution survived, ultimately, the presidency of Ronald Reagan. But in the late Cold War, when these audiences kind of across the globe were becoming increasingly kind of disillusioned by utopian ideas of national liberation and socialism, obviously, what was happening in Eastern Europe had an impact as well. So in that kind of shifting Cold War landscape, the FSLN could no longer hold on to power. So in February 1990, after more than a decade of civil war, economic decline, international pressure, the Nicaraguan people voted the FSLN out of office. So the Nicaraguan revolution had, at least for the time being, come to an end. And this is also where the history in the book ends. But obviously, the history of the revolution is in a way continued, and there's a lot more to be said about kind of the legacies and aftermath of the Sandinista project. Now, beyond helping us to understand Nicaragua's history and the global impact that the Sandinista revolution had, why does this history matter? What can we learn from it? And besides that, I think it matters in itself. It's important. I think it also helps us to understand three kind of key things. And first is that it helps us to kind of really see, and it demonstrates the ability of a small revolutionary movement and later government to use the international environment to its own advantage. And I think the Sandinistas' revolutionary diplomacy shows that power in international relations is more than brute force and just financial strength. And smaller states often rely on different, but not necessarily less influential, sources of power to pursue their goals. So they use and they create kind of opportunities for themselves in the international arena by adopting very creative and sometimes quite unconventional strategies. So the book builds on the idea that public opinion, culture, and perceptions are really powerful tools in international relations. And in doing so, it explains, I think, why the Sandinistas, for a significant amount of time, managed to build and maintain a revolutionary state, despite what seemed to be quite negative odds. But it also shows that narratives and perceptions and ideas are complex and unpredictable. So states like the FSLN or the Sandinista government, they can use them to their own advantage, and they sometimes do so quite effectively. But they're also quite difficult, if not impossible, to influence. Forces more powerful than states such as nationalism, anti-imperialism, socialism, and globalization, the end of the Cold War, they changed world politics. And as they did so, states, including the superpowers, could do little more than kind of improvise and adapt. And in the case of the Sandinistas, of the Nicaraguan Revolution, I think the decline of Cold War tensions, perhaps somewhat ironically, meant that their revolutionary diplomacy no longer fell onto fertile ground as it did in the early 1980s. So the ideas on which their foreign policy depended, they were no longer as powerful as they once were. And even though they tried to adapt to this new global context, for instance, by kind of focusing more on the concept of democracy, human rights language, after more than kind of a decade of economic hardship and civil war, they just were no longer up to the task in the late 1980s. And my second point is about the study of transnational solidarity activism and what it can tell us about North-South relations in the Cold War, or solidarity activism more in general. And I think in the literature there is still a bit of a tendency to kind of romanticize solidarity activism. And we still pay perhaps little attention to the ways in which kind of fluctuating power dynamics, tensions and hierarchies infuse the relationship between, in this case, the European activists and the revolutionary politicians. And as I show in the book, the collaboration between the Sandinistas on the one hand and the transnational activists on the other was not always as smooth as it appeared to be on the surface. So overall, these activists were well-intentioned and they were genuine in their desire to contribute to the Nicaraguan Revolution's success. But of course, these kind of intentions can also be misguided. So these many solidarity activists, disillusioned with the lack of kind of revolutionary progress or the kind of move towards the right in their own countries, they projected their hopes and dreams and political ambitions onto Nicaragua. So more than just contributing to the revolution, they also wanted to participate in it. So they wanted to feel part and be part and influence a project that was ultimately not their own. And to be sure, the FSLN did encourage this sentiment and sometimes kind of managed to harness it for the revolution's benefit. But there were also kind of many occasions in which the activists' individual ambitions were directly at odds with kind of what the FSLN wanted and perhaps the Nicaraguan people also needed. So this kind of question of developmental aid or financial aid, which was a key priority for the FSLN, which struggled to raise the country's standard of living, but at the same time fundraising was simply not an appealing task to these Western activists. They preferred what they called more political work over what they saw as purely humanitarian campaigns. So efforts by the FSLN to kind of centralize the solidarity activist movement to make it more effective and easier to coordinate, these were kind of actively resisted by activists who opted for more intimate relationships in the form of kind of so-called sister city bonds with Nicaraguan cities, schools, and labor unions, or they prefer to kind of travel to Nicaragua to paint murals such as the one you see on the slide, in which they also reference a kind of controversial tax measure taking place in the UK, which obviously no one in Nicaragua would know what they were talking about, which kind of highlights how concerned they were about their own kind of political situation and how they kind of idealized Nicaragua at the same time. So the third and final point I wanted to make is about Latin America and its relationship to the wider world. And I think for a long time, historians has made it seem that countries and ideas originating in the West have shaped the global South. And obviously this is changing, thankfully. There are many, many excellent books coming out showing the opposite. And I see my book as doing something similar. And I think the point of telling the story of the Sandinistas' outreach to Western Europe is to show how people and ideas and events originating in Latin America traveled across borders and really came to transform the character and dynamics of the Cold War. And I think one of the more kind of surprising consequences of the Central American civil wars and the Sandinistas' diplomacy was that it contributed to this idea of Western Europe playing a global role, acting independently from the United States. Although mostly supporting the US role, there was a kind of European dimension that was different. And to be sure, this process was already underway before the Sandinistas' victory, but I think concerns that the Central American civil wars could be used by the Soviet Union to weaken Western Europe's position in the Cold War really helped to convince European leaders that they had to play a more active international role. And this European initiative would not have taken place if it wasn't for the Contadora process, a regional Latin American peace process. But certainly it was Latin Americans then who drove and pushed Europeans to play this role. So this is just to show that Latin America's influence on the world should not be underestimated. So not only did actors from the region actively shape European foreign policies, but the collaboration between Europe or the European community, what later became the European Union, and various Latin American coalitions also kind of highlights the multipolarity of the late Cold War and how this formed a challenge to US power in Central America. And on a more kind of personal level, the story of the Sandinistas also helps us understand the various ways in which individuals experienced the Cold War. So the Nicaraguan Revolution and the struggles that accompanied it, they transformed individual politics and local politics and individual lives and grassroots activism, not just in the Americas, but also in other areas of the world. So while town councillors in the UK engaged in kind of heated debates about the legitimacy of the Sandinista revolution, school children in the Netherlands listened to Nicaraguan music, and West German solidarity activists befriended Nicaraguans they otherwise would have never met, I think the ideas at the heart of this battle over the Sandinista revolution increasingly became part of Western Europeans' everyday lives as well. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you again so much to Lassa and the Book Prize Committee for this incredible honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina, for your presentation, and congratulations. Well, the time passed very fast. Well, thank you again to be with us today and the people who are seeing on Zoom. And again, congratulations, Diego and Alina, for your Books Award. Have an excellent day.